Hey guys, tonight we journey back into a world where rulers didn't just govern, they literally strutted around as gods. Imagine your country's president deciding tomorrow that he's also the Son incarnate, the divine heir of heaven, and the sole person keeping the universe from collapsing. Yeah, awkward. But in ancient Egypt, that wasn't awkward. It was normal. Pharaohs weren't just political figures. They were divine beings walking among mortals, their every sneeze interpreted as cosmic approval, their every failure a potential apocalypse. And on the flip side, across the Mediterranean, the Greeks had their Olympians, gods who acted less like serene sages and more like a dysfunctional family on reality TV. Thunderbolts, love affairs, petty grudges. It was basically a divine soap opera with mortals caught in the middle. So tonight's story, we're diving headfirst into daily life under divine authority, what it actually meant to live under rulers who claimed to be gods, or gods who behaved like rulers. Spoiler alert, it wasn't all golden thrones, pyramids, and philosophical musings. Most of the time, it was sweaty, backbreaking, and just a touch absurd. Before we get rolling, you know the drill. Hit that like button, smash subscribe if you haven't already, and drop me a comment below with your current location and the time you're watching this. I love seeing where in the world these late-night history dives reach. And hey, dim the lights, maybe light a candle, or turn on that trusty fam for some soft white noise. Because we're about to peel back the polished marble and sunlit temples to see the cracks underneath. Now, picture yourself in ancient Egypt, standing at the edge of the Nile. The river glimmers, the sun beats down, and somewhere upriver, Pharaoh is reminding everyone he's literally the son of Ra, the sun god himself. This isn't metaphor, this is law. To disobey Pharaoh isn't just treason, it's blasphemy, cosmic rebellion. Imagine arguing with your boss at work and someone saying, "By the way, you just offended the entire order of the universe. Also, the gods might smite you now." Yeah, tough HR department. But divine kingship wasn't just about grandeur. It filtered into everything. Taxes weren't just civic duties. They were sacred offerings. Labor wasn't just labor. It was service to the eternal cosmos. And bread wasn't just bread. It was literally rationed proof that the gods smiled on the harvest. Let's be real. Most people didn't get to bask in marble palaces. They were out there sweating in mud brick homes, hauling water, baking bread in smoky little ovens, and praying Pharaoh's cosmic order meant enough Nile floods to keep them alive another year. Now, let's jump west across the Mediterranean. Greece, land of olive oil, drama, and gods with some serious temper issues. You think family reunions get messy? Try Mount Olympus. Zeus can't keep his hands or lightning bolts to himself. Hera's raging, Poseidon's sulking, and mortals. Mortals are the chew toys in the middle of this divine squabble. And yet, somehow, these were the gods people worshipped, honored, and built temples for. The irony is rich. Egyptians bowed to the serene, cosmic king gods. Greeks bowed to beings who were basically exaggerated versions of themselves, lustful, jealous, hangry, and you, the average ancient Joe or Jane, had to build your entire life around their whims. Wake up at dawn, grind grain by hand until your arms feel like lead, tend goats or haul stones, and then, oh yes, make sure you perform the right ritual so Zeus doesn't fry your village out of boredom. Talk about work-life balance. But here's the kicker. Divine authority wasn't just about religion. It shaped law, economies, family life, even bathroom habits. Yes, bathroom habits. In Egypt, cleanliness was next to godliness. Literally, priests shaved their bodies smooth, bathed multiple times a day, and doused themselves in perfume. Meanwhile, you, the farmer, are probably rinsing off in the Nile next to your goats, hoping crocodiles aren't in the mood for dinner. Yet, both acts, lavish temple bathing and scrappy river splashing, were done under the same cosmic logic. Keep the gods happy, keep the world spinning. So, the question is, what did this actually feel like day to day? Did Egyptians really believe Pharaoh was a god? Or was it more like everyone nodding along to the big guy's claims while muttering under their breath? And when a Greek farmer poured out his morning wine offering to Dionysus, did he truly think the god was watching? Or was it more like hedging bets against cosmic bad luck? Stick around, because that's what we're about to unpack. Not just the temples and titles, but the dirt floors, the street markets, the sweat, the bread, the gossip, and the fear that maybe, just maybe, the gods were watching, and they weren't in a particularly forgiving mood. And let's be clear, this isn't the romanticized history you got in high school textbooks, all pyramids and marble statues. No, we're peeling off the gold leaf and finding the grime underneath. The human stories, the moments where divine authority collided with daily survival. The nights when someone whispered, "Is Pharaoh really Ra's son, or just another guy who bleeds when he's cut?" The mornings when Greek villagers grumbled, "If Zeus is king of the gods, why does he act like a drunk uncle at a wedding?" So grab that blanket, settle in, and let's step into their world. One where the line between divine and human wasn't just blurred, it was deliberately erased, and everyone had to play along. So there you are, sweating in the Egyptian sun, convinced, or at least told daily, that Pharaoh is Ra's son, Horus incarnate, a walking bridge between gods and mortals. What does that mean for you? It means every action you take, every crop you plant, every brick you haul, isn't just for your family. It's to uphold something called Ma'at, balance, cosmic order. Break it, and you're not just a rebel. You're a threat to the entire fabric of existence. No pressure, right? And this idea of Ma'at wasn't some vague philosophical nonsense. It was drilled into daily life like a background soundtrack. Farmers paid grain taxes, not because the bureaucracy needed it, though oh boy it did, but because the pharaoh demanded offerings to keep the gods fed. Priests lit incense at dawn, not just to smell fancy, but to literally sustain the gods. The world only kept spinning because everyone, from the king to the guy mucking out donkey stalls, did their part. Imagine living under the constant anxiety that if you slacked off for one day, the sun might not rise tomorrow. Forget burnout. This was existential burnout. But here's the thing. People weren't dumb. Sure, Pharaoh was a god in theory, but did the average mud brick dwelling Egyptian really buy into the full divinity package? Evidence suggests it was complicated. To them, Pharaoh's power was real enough. He controlled armies, food supplies, temple economies. He was the law. So maybe the divinity part was half belief, half survival tactic. If bowing a little lower kept your head on your shoulders, you bowed lower. Humans are good at practical faith when it pays the bills, or keeps them breathing. Now, let's flip the scene to Greece. The divine landscape was utterly different. Instead of one god king with cosmic order hanging on his every decree, you had a whole gang of bickering immortals, each with their own mood swings and favorite mortals. Picture trying to appease a divine HOA board that never, ever agreed on anything. Zeus demanded sacrifice, Hera demanded loyalty, Athena wanted brains over brawn, and Dionysus, well, let's just say his religious festivals didn't exactly promote moderation. And here you are, a mortal, trying to juggle it all. Miss one ritual, insult one god, and suddenly your crops fail or your kid gets mysteriously sick. What's fascinating is that the Greeks didn't really expect their gods to be paragons of virtue. Quite the opposite. They expected them to act like spoiled aristocrats with cosmic power. And in some twisted way, that made the system more believable. Mortals knew life wasn't fair. Why should Olympus be any different? If your landlord's a jerk, of course Zeus is too. At least you can pour out a libation to soften him up. Try doing that with your landlord. But let's return to daily grind mode for a second. Life under divine authority wasn't just about rituals and taxes. It was about how those ideas shaped your routines. Egyptians woke up early, often before sunrise, because work had to align with the Nile's rhythms. The river flooded, depositing fertile silt, and suddenly everyone was conscripted into planting or building. That wasn't community service. That was Pharaoh's cosmic project. Imagine your government calling you up for jury duty, but instead of listening to a court case, you're hauling 2-ton limestone blocks to ensure the afterlife of your divine king is cushy. And yes, they did it without the wheel for much of Egyptian history. Meanwhile, in Greece, daily life was more localized. You might live in a small polis where civic religion revolved around a particular patron god or goddess. Athens had Athena, Sparta loved Ares, Corinth looked to Poseidon. The gods weren't abstract, they were civic mascots, with temples as literal PR campaigns. You prayed, sacrificed, and attended festivals not only out of devotion, but because not showing up made you look like a bad citizen. Religion and politics were so intertwined, you couldn't separate them with a sword. Now here's a fun thought experiment. Hygiene. Yes, hygiene under divine authority. Egyptians were freakishly clean compared to most ancient cultures. Priests shaved their heads and bodies daily, wore spotless linen, and bathed obsessively. Why? Because cleanliness wasn't just personal, it was holy. You don't serve the gods with sweaty armpits and lice crawling around your scalp. Meanwhile, your average Egyptian peasant wasn't bathing in imported perfume, but the Nile was right there, and people used it constantly. Crocodiles aside, it was a community bath, laundry spot, and water source all in one. Greeks, on the other hand, had their gymnasia, public spaces where working out and bathing were tied to civic and even spiritual identity. Imagine sweating it out at the gym and then offering prayers to Hermes or Apollo right after. The gods weren't some distant cosmic force. They were right there in the locker room, metaphorically speaking, which, considering Zeus's reputation, is a little unnerving. Let's not forget food. In Egypt, bread and beer were staples, not luxury, staples. Everyone, from Pharaoh to the bricklayer, relied on them. These weren't just snacks, they were life and cosmic order, baked and brewed daily. Bread was baked in communal ovens, often smoky and uneven, while beer was more like a chunky porridge drink. You didn't have a choice. This was survival fuel. Every bite and sip tied you, however indirectly, to the Pharaoh's divine promise. As long as I'm God King, the Nile floods, grain grows, and you get to eat. In Greece, meals were often tied to ritual. Pouring out a libation of wine before drinking wasn't just manners, it was mandatory. Even a farmer gulping cheap wine would tip a little onto the ground for Dionysus or the household gods. Meals were mini rituals, everyday reminders that divine eyes were always watching. And honestly, it probably made your watered-down wine taste a little better to imagine the god of revelry joining your table. So, whether you're an Egyptian farmer breaking your back on Pharaoh's projects, or a Greek shepherd trying to avoid Zeus's random lightning bolts, one truth stands out. Daily life wasn't just about survival. It was about managing relationships with beings who had way too much power, whether embodied in a human ruler or perched on a celestial mountain. And every decision, every crumb of bread, every bath, every sacrifice, it all fed into that divine system. Now, let's zoom in on the idea of fear, because fear wasn't just an emotion in ancient societies under divine authority, it was a management tool. In Egypt, Pharaoh didn't need to constantly swing a sword or patrol the streets himself. He had priests, scribes, and a whole bureaucratic machine reinforcing the cosmic script. Pharaoh is divine. Pharaoh ensures Ma'at. Pharaoh keeps the Nile flowing. And what happens if you don't pay your grain taxes? Well, you're not just cheating the state, you're literally sabotaging the balance of the universe. Congratulations, you've gone from farmer to cosmic criminal overnight. Think about that psychological weight. Your harvest is bad. Was it because you didn't pray hard enough? Because your neighbor skipped a ritual? Or because Pharaoh somehow disapproved? When bad things happened, you didn't blame bad luck. You blamed broken cosmic order. It was a convenient system, too. If Pharaoh succeeded, it was proof he was divine. If Pharaoh failed, well, that was your fault for not working hard enough to keep the gods happy. Heads I win, tails you lose. The Greeks played a similar but more chaotic game. Their gods were unpredictable, and that unpredictability was weaponized socially. Let's say your vineyard got wiped out by a storm. Easy explanation. Zeus was pissed. Why? Maybe you forgot a sacrifice. Maybe your neighbor did. Maybe Zeus just felt like flexing his muscles that day. And since the gods mirrored human vices, there was no neat sense of fairness. The randomness itself reinforced the need to keep up the rituals, because skipping them wasn't just lazy, it was gambling with forces that had zero chill. Now imagine yourself as an average worker under this system. In Egypt, you're out in the fields, bending your back under the sun, but every swing of your sickle has this extra weight. It's not just feeding your family, it's feeding Pharaoh's cosmic engine. And remember, Pharaoh wasn't exactly subtle about reminding people of his role. His face was carved into colossal statues, staring down at you from temple walls, his name etched into monuments, so that no matter where you turned, the divine brand was stamped into your reality. Marketing departments today could take notes. Pharaoh had the ultimate PR campaign, powered by stone and eternity. In Greece, the reminder of divine authority was less centralized, but everywhere. Shrines dotted the countryside. Small altars stood at crossroads, in homes, in marketplaces. You didn't need a giant statue of Zeus looming over you 24/7. The little offerings in daily life reinforced the same truth. The gods were always there, always watching, and usually not in the mood to be ignored. And every festival, every Olympic game, every sacrifice wasn't just religious. It was civic duty, entertainment, and cultural glue rolled into one. Let's talk work obligations for a moment, because this is where divine authority really bit into the lives of regular people. When Pharaoh wanted a pyramid, guess who built it? Spoiler, not aliens. Farmers, conscripted during the Nile's flood season when fields couldn't be worked, were drafted into labor gangs. They got food rations and maybe some beer, but make no mistake, this wasn't volunteer work. It was framed as service to the gods, ensuring the afterlife of the divine king, which in turn supposedly ensured everyone's prosperity. It was a neat way of turning back-breaking labor into a religious duty. The Greeks didn't have pyramid projects, but they did have temple construction and public works tied to divine worship. Want a new temple to Athena? Congratulations, the city's treasury is drained. Artisans are roped into decades of carving marble, and sleeves do the grunt work. And why? Because not honoring Athena properly could mean disaster in war, famine, or disease. Imagine a mayor today saying, "We're diverting the entire budget to build a mega cathedral so the gods don't wreck our economy." Sounds absurd now, but for Greeks, it was basic survival logic. Food again provides a sharp contrast. In Egypt, communal granaries stored surplus grain, managed by scribes who could tally up your contribution to the cosmic order with infuriating precision. And if the records showed you hadn't delivered enough, let's just say divine wrath had a way of looking a lot like human punishment, fines, beatings, or worse. The Greeks, by contrast, tied food more directly to sacrifice. Burning the best cuts of meat for the gods while you and your family ate the leftovers wasn't just ritual. It was a visible reminder that divine beings came first, mortals second. And let's not ignore gender roles under divine authority. Egyptian women, surprisingly, had more legal rights than many of their contemporaries. They could own property, initiate divorce, and manage businesses. But even that independence was framed under divine order, the goddess Isis as the archetype of wife and mother, Hathor as joy and fertility. Women's roles weren't just practical, they were sacralized. In Greece, it was trickier. Goddesses like Athena and Artemis were powerful, sure, but mortal women, mostly stuck at home, excluded from politics, rarely allowed to participate in the grand public rituals beyond supportive roles. The divine hierarchy didn't translate equally into mortal freedoms. So whether you were in Egypt or Greece, divine authority didn't just float in the clouds. It seeped into the cracks of your daily existence. It told you when to work, how to bathe, what to eat, what festivals to attend, even how to think about gender, family, and power. It was omnipresent, like Wi-Fi you couldn't turn off. And the kicker, you didn't even need to believe all of it. You just needed to act as if you did. Because belief was optional, but participation wasn't. Let's take a stroll into the temple. Because temples weren't just places to pray. They were the beating hearts of divine authority. In Egypt, a temple wasn't some quiet parish church. It was a vast complex, equal parts spiritual powerhouse, bureaucratic office, and economic machine. Priests weren't just holy men, they were accountants, managers, and PR specialists rolled into one. Picture a Costco, a government tax office, and a cathedral all mashed together, with incense burning in the background. That's a temple. And remember, most people didn't even get access to the inner sanctums. The average farmer could show up, offer prayers at the outer court, maybe donate a goose if they were feeling generous. But the real action, that happened deep inside, where priests performed rituals the public never saw. Statues of gods weren't just carved rock, they were considered living beings. Each morning, priests woke up the gods, washed their statues, dressed them, and fed them offerings. Imagine serving breakfast to a giant golden statue, murmuring prayers while knowing thousands of eyes outside believed this kept the sun rising. That was daily routine. Meanwhile, across the sea, Greek temples operated on a different wavelength. Yes, they were dazzling architectural wonders, but the gods didn't live in temples the same way Egyptian deities did. The statue inside was a focus, a symbolic presence, but the rituals were more public, more communal. Sacrifices weren't whispered mysteries, they were bloody barbecues. Animals slaughtered in front of the crowd, smoke curling up to the heavens, while everyone partook in the feast afterward. If the Egyptian temple was a closed-door boardroom, the Greek one was an open-air block party with divine guests. But let's not romanticize it. Temples in both cultures were money pits, and they drained resources like a bottomless hole. In Egypt, Temple estates owned vast tracts of farmland, controlled labor, and hoarded wealth. Pharaoh might have been divine, but temples were his corporate partners, and together they monopolized the economy. For the average Egyptian, that meant endless demands: work more, give more, sacrifice more. Sound familiar? That's because divine authority, in practice, looked a lot like corporate monopoly, just with more incense and fewer quarterly reports. And the Greeks weren't immune either. Temples were expensive, and they became symbols of civic pride. The Parthenon wasn't built just to honor Athena. It was a declaration of Athenian power, a marble billboard shouting, "We're richer and holier than you." And who paid for it? Surprise, ordinary citizens, through taxes, labor, and the spoils of war. In both Egypt and Greece, temples were proof that the divine was always funded, because skimping on a god's house was asking for trouble. Now let's zoom out to festivals, because divine authority wasn't just about work and taxes. It also threw parties, huge ones. In Egypt, festivals like Opet saw Pharaoh paraded through the streets, carried on golden barges, while the entire city celebrated. These weren't spontaneous carnivals. They were staged reminders that Pharaoh wasn't just ruling. He was embodying the divine right in full display. For ordinary Egyptians, it was equal parts spectacle, holiday, and propaganda rally. You got a day off, maybe some free beer, and the reinforcement that your sweaty labor under the sun wasn't pointless. It was part of something eternal. Greece? Oh, the Greeks loved a festival. Dionysian festivals were basically the ancient equivalent of spring break with a sacred excuse. Wine flowed, plays were performed, masks came out, and suddenly everyone was part of this massive, citywide spiritual hangover. And let's not forget the Olympic Games. At their core, these weren't just athletic competitions. They were offerings to Zeus. Imagine a sports event where every race, every discus throw, every sweaty wrestler was a literal act of worship. Winning wasn't just glory, it was divine endorsement. And losing, well, maybe the gods just didn't like you that year. But festivals weren't all joy and laughter. They carried a darker undertone too. If the festivals went badly, if weather ruined the celebration, if sacrifices seemed off, people panicked. It was a sign the gods were displeased, that cosmic order was wobbling. Suddenly, a celebration turned into an existential crisis. Imagine your citywide parade ending with everyone whispering, "We're doomed, Hera's pissed." Pack it up, folks. That's how thin the line was between joy and dread under divine authority. And speaking of dread, let's talk punishment. Divine wrath wasn't always some vague concept. In Egypt, Pharaoh's justice was divine justice. Insult Pharaoh. You weren't just insulting the state. You were undermining the entire cosmic system. Punishments could be brutal: beatings, mutilations, exile, or worse. And because Pharaoh was divine, the sentence carried not just earthly weight, but eternal consequence. You weren't just paying for your crime, you were condemning your soul. The Greeks outsourced divine punishment to myth. Step out of line, and you might not get smacked by Zeus directly, but everyone knew the stories. Niobe insulted Leto. Boom, all her children killed. Arachne got too cocky with her weaving. Hello, eternal spider life. These myths weren't bedtime stories. They were cautionary tales designed to scare you straight. They drilled in the idea that even the smallest disrespect could trigger God-tier retribution. And since the gods were basically a walking HR nightmare, there was no such thing as safe disrespect. So, whether through temples, festivals, or punishment, the message was the same. The divine was in charge, and you were a supporting character in their grand narrative. Pharaoh embodied cosmic balance. The Olympians embodied chaos with power. Either way, your job was to keep them happy, or at least keep up the performance of keeping them happy, because pretending you believed was sometimes the only shield against very real consequences. Let's step inside an ordinary Egyptian house, because here's where divine authority got personal. Forget golden thrones. Your house was mud brick, plain, hot, and filled with buzzing flies. Roofs were flat, often doubling as sleeping quarters when the heat was unbearable. Families cooked in little clay ovens, the air smoky and choking, while kids ran around barefoot in the dust. Yet even in this cramped, sweaty environment, the gods were there. Small household shrines with clay figures of protective deities. Bes with his lion face and stubby limbs. Taweret, the hippo goddess guarding childbirth, stood watch. Divine authority wasn't just out there in temples or carved into stone colossi. It was crammed into the corner of your living room, a daily reminder that the gods had front row seats to your life. Now, shift the scene to Greece. Homes were also simple, often clustered around a courtyard. Women usually ran the household, spinning wool, baking bread, raising kids, while men were out in the fields or the agora. And yet, here too, shrines popped up in kitchens, doorways, and hearths. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, literally lived in the fire where you cooked dinner. Every meal began with a little ritual to her. Imagine striking a match for your stove today and muttering a prayer so your spaghetti doesn't anger a goddess. That was daily life. So, what does this mean? It means divine authority wasn't just some lofty political slogan. It was baked, smoked, and whispered into the fabric of daily routine. You couldn't escape it. Even your breakfast was spiritual PR. Now let's talk about the work that made all this possible. Egyptians were farmers above all. Wheat, barley, flax, these weren't just crops. They were survival. And the rhythm of farming was tied directly to the Nile's cycle. When the river flooded, it was both a blessing and a cosmic mandate. Pharaoh was praised for the abundance, and if things went wrong, clearly someone had screwed up the rituals. Farmers spent months breaking their backs in the fields, their bodies bent and blistered, and at the end, much of the harvest went to Pharaoh's granaries. Was this just taxation? Sure, but it was wrapped in divine packaging. Your grain feeds the gods, and therefore feeds the world. Kind of hard to argue with that sales pitch. Greek farmers had it no easier. Rocky soil, unpredictable weather, constant risk of famine. Agriculture here was survival on hard mode. Olives, grapes, and grain were the staples, but harvests were always precarious. And since the gods were seen as directly meddling in nature, every bad harvest screamed divine displeasure. Thunderstorm, Zeus. Drought, Apollo. Too much wine and chaos, Dionysus, obviously. The land itself felt like divine property, and you were just renting space, paying with prayers and sacrifices instead of rent checks. And let's not forget labor beyond the farm. Egyptian workers were drafted into construction projects, carving temples and hauling stone, their sweat cemented into monuments that still tower today. For them, these weren't just buildings, they were eternal testimonies of Pharaoh's divinity. Sure, they got bread and beer as rations, maybe some camaraderie, but it was still grueling, dusty, dangerous work. And at the end of the day, the monuments didn't bear the workers' names. They bore Pharaohs. Imagine pouring your life into a project, only for your boss to slap his name on it in 20-foot hieroglyphs. That's divine authority for you. In Greece, labor looked different, but carried the same undertones. Slaves, captured in wars or born into servitude, were the backbone of the economy. From farming to mining to domestic service. And the system was propped up by divine sanction. Slavery wasn't just practical, it was natural, backed by myths like Zeus dividing people into rulers and servants. Even Aristotle bought into it. So the divine stamp was everywhere, justifying human exploitation, as if the gods had signed the contract. But beyond work and worship, there's leisure, or what passed for it. Did Egyptians ever get to relax? Sort of. Music, board games like Senet, beer-drinking parties, these offered temporary escape. But even these activities had divine shadows. Games could be tied to fate and the afterlife. Music linked to Hathor, and drinking framed as both pleasure and ritual. Leisure wasn't neutral. It was another thread in the divine web. And the Greeks, they practically invented the idea of mixing leisure with religion. Theater, for instance, wasn't just entertainment. It was born out of Dionysian festivals. You sat in an amphitheater, watched actors in masks reenact stories of gods, kings, and tragic mortals, and the whole thing was part worship. Imagine if going to see a Marvel movie today was considered an act of devotion to a god. That was Greek drama, religious blockbusters with cosmic consequences. So whether working, eating, sleeping, or playing, mortals lived under the shadow of divine oversight. Pharaoh's statues stared down from temple walls. Olympian myths whispered from every theater mask. And the message was relentless. Your life isn't just yours. It's part of a cosmic contract. Break it, and the fallout isn't just poverty or disease. It's cosmic collapse, divine temper tantrums, eternal judgment. And here's the ironic part. Did people sometimes quietly doubt all this? Of course, ancient graffiti, jokes, and even certain texts hint that skepticism bubbled under the surface. A farmer probably rolled his eyes when Pharaoh claimed credit for the Nile's flood. A Greek villager likely grumbled that Zeus was more busy chasing nymphs than blessing harvests. But doubt didn't matter. The system ran on collective performance. Everyone bowed, prayed, sacrificed, not always because they believed, but because not doing it was too risky. Think of it as the ancient version of better safe than sorry. Let's talk about fear in the afterlife. Because if divine authority ruled daily bread and labor, it absolutely dominated death. In Egypt, the afterlife wasn't a vague hope. It was a full-time obsession. Death was just the beginning of a cosmic bureaucratic nightmare. Your heart was literally weighed against a feather. And if it came up heavy with sin, boom, snack time for Amit, the crocodile, lion, hippo monster. You didn't get hell, you got annihilation. Gone. Erased. Imagine living every day under the pressure that one wrong move could doom not just your earthly life, but your eternal one. And who guaranteed your passage through all this? Pharaoh, of course. His divine authority wasn't just about keeping the Nile in check. It extended into eternity. If he built his massive tomb right, performed the right rituals, and kept Ma'at, then you too had a shot at eternal bliss. If Pharaoh failed, well, enjoy being monster chow. That's how tangled your fate was, with a man wearing a double crown and pretending he was the sun's offspring. The Greeks, by contrast, had an afterlife that was, honestly, kind of depressing. Most mortals ended up in the shadowy gloom of Hades. Endless gray nothingness. No golden fields, no eternal feasts. Just wandering around as a shade, bored out of your incorporeal skull. The best you could hope for was the Elysian fields, reserved for heroes, demigods, and the occasional poet who really sucked up to the gods. For everyone else, eternal mediocrity. And yet, despite this dreary prospect, Greeks poured resources into funerary rituals, proper burials, offerings to the dead, libations at graves. Why? Because neglecting the dead offended the gods and risked their wrath. Divine authority didn't end at death's door. It followed you 6 feet under. Now, let's bring it back to the world of medicine. Because even sickness carried divine fingerprints. In Egypt, healers weren't just doctors. They were priests, magicians, and pharmacists rolled into one. Illness wasn't explained as, you got germs, but a god is mad, or a spirit slipped inside you. The cure? Spells, amulets, herbal remedies, prayers. Got a toothache? Sure, choose some herbs, but also wear an amulet of Hathor and whisper an incantation so the gods know you're serious. Medicine was half science, half religion, and 100% under divine jurisdiction. Greece played a similar tune, but added drama. Enter Asclepius, god of healing, whose sanctuaries doubled as hospitals. People slept in these temples, hoping for dream visions of cures, sometimes waking up to snakes slithering around, sacred animals of the god. Creepy, sure, but also effective, or at least convincing. And even when Greek doctors like Hippocrates started moving toward rational medicine, divine authority still loomed. The Hippocratic Oath, sworn to Apollo, Asclepius, and other gods. You could study anatomy, but don't forget who you ultimately answered to. And this divine meddling in health had real consequences. Imagine you're an Egyptian farmer with an infection. You've got two options. Rub some honey on it, which surprisingly works as an antiseptic, and recite a spell. Or risk the priest doctor saying your sickness is punishment for failing a ritual. In Greece, you might actually get surgery, but only after making an offering to Asclepius to ensure the gods didn't sabotage the process. Either way, medicine was never just about the body. It was about keeping divine favor intact. Now, speaking of divine favor, let's not ignore war, because nothing exposes the fingerprints of divine authority like the battlefield. In Egypt, Pharaoh wasn't just a general. He was a living god leading troops. Every victory was painted as proof of his divinity. Every defeat, never Pharaoh's fault, usually written out of official records altogether. You could march into battle convinced the gods were literally fighting on your side because your leader was a god. Good for morale, terrible for acknowledging reality. The Greeks, meanwhile, built war around their divine soap opera. Before every campaign, sacrifices had to be made. Omens read, entrails examined. If the signs were bad, you didn't march. Period. Forget your brilliant strategy. You weren't going anywhere without divine permission. And in the middle of battle, everyone believed the gods were there too, picking sides. Homer's Iliad is basically one long account of gods treating mortals like chess pieces, stepping in to save their favorites or crush enemies. Imagine going to war and thinking, we've got Athena in our corner. Too bad the other guys have Ares. That's not just tactics, that's gambling with divine poker chips. What's fascinating is how mortals rationalized the brutality. In Egypt, if Pharaoh led a campaign and slaughtered thousands, it wasn't just politics, it was cosmic justice. He wasn't conquering people, he was restoring Ma'at. In Greece, war was explained as divine squabbles spilling into human affairs. Your city didn't just fight Sparta. Athena and Ares were duking it out through your soldiers. The horror of war became easier to swallow when framed as divine drama. And through all of this, who carried the burden? You, the regular mortal. The famo drafted to hurl weapons, the woman left behind to pray for safety, the family scraping to pay war taxes. Divine authority made sure war wasn't just bloody, it was holy. And when you stood on the battlefield, sweat stinging your eyes, sword shaking in your grip, you didn't just fear the enemy's spear. You feared that somewhere above, Zeus or Ra was watching, waiting to see if you flinched. You know what's strange? For all this divine pageantry, the everyday grind still came down to food. Because gods may have thundered from temples, but if the bread was stale and the beer sour, the whole system cracked. In Egypt, food wasn't just sustenance, it was cosmic order in edible form. Bread and beer were life, gifts from Osiris himself, Lord of agriculture. Every loaf you chewed wasn't just calories, it was proof that Pharaoh's pact with the gods was still working. The Nile flooded, the fields grew, the ovens baked. That was the divine contract in action. But here's the catch. Bread wasn't soft and fluffy like you're picturing. No, Egyptian bread was basically edible sandpaper. Why? Because grinding flour with stone mills meant bits of grit and rock ended up in the dough. Chew enough of that, and you'd grind your teeth down to stubs by middle age. Imagine losing your molars at 30, not because of sugar, but because your diet was literally grinding your jaw into oblivion, and people still thank the gods for it. Talk about gratitude. Beer, on the other hand, was the saving grace. Thick, porridge-like, not something you'd sip at a pub, but gulp as a meal substitute. Workers at Giza were paid in loaves and beer, not coins. Your paycheck was essentially carbs and buzz. And again, divine authority loomed. Beer was sacred, tied to Hathor and Sekhmet, who apparently needed humans to stay tipsy so they didn't go on rampages. You didn't just drink to relax, you drank to keep cosmic balance. That's responsibility in a mug. Now jump over to Greece, and food takes on a different divine twist. Banquets weren't just feasts, they were theater. To eat wasn't only to live, but to honor the gods. Sacrifice was the main course of religion. You slaughtered an animal, burned the best bits for Zeus, and kept the rest for the people. Dinner was literally a shared meal with the divine. And if the smoke didn't rise properly or the sacrifice looked sloppy, you risked offending the gods. Imagine hosting a dinner party where one bad steak ruins not just the night, but your city's entire future. No pressure. Daily meals for regular Greeks, though, were less glamorous. Bread, olives, cheese, maybe some fish if you were lucky. Meat was rare, unless of course it came from a sacrifice. And wine? Always watered down. Drinking it neat was barbaric, uncivilized, the kind of thing Thracians did. At symposia, those fancy drinking parties, the wine bowl was mixed carefully to ensure just the right level of buzz. Not too sober, not blackout drunk. And hovering over it all was Dionysus, god of wine, madness, and theater. He was the life of the party, but also the threat of chaos if you overdid it. Greeks managed their intoxication like it was a religious balancing act. And what about farmers, the people actually producing all this divine cuisine? In Egypt, farmers had one of the harshest lives imaginable. Every year was a race against the Nile. Too much flood, your crops drowned. Too little, famine struck. And through it all, taxes had to be paid, not in coins, but in grain. Inspectors from Pharaoh's administration, agents of divine authority, showed up to measure your harvest. If you came up short, good luck. You might end up beaten, fined, or forced into labor. Imagine sweating under the sun, only to have officials scoop away the fruits of your labor in the name of the gods. It wasn't just taxation, it was divine extortion with a cosmic stamp of approval. Greek farmers had their own headaches. Soil in much of Greece was rocky, stubborn, and barely generous. Grapes and olives grew, but wheat and barley were tough. That meant dependence on trade and imports, especially from colonies across the Mediterranean. And again, the gods hovered. A failed harvest wasn't blamed on soil quality, it was Demir's displeasure. Festivals like the Thesmophoria weren't just seasonal celebrations, they were fertility insurance policies. Women performed rituals, sometimes involving symbolic sacrifices and strange fertility rites, to make sure Demeter kept the grain growing. Your pantry was at the mercy of divine moods. And let's not romanticize this farming life. Waking at dawn, hacking away at fields, blistered hands, calloused feet, insects biting, backs breaking, hunger gnawing. This wasn't the golden pastoral dream you see in painted vases. It was grueling labor dressed up as divine duty. And every time you cursed your lot, you had to remember, this was Pharaoh's will, Zeus's design. Because complaining against the system wasn't just rebellion against man, it was heresy against the gods themselves. Yet in all this drudgery, festivals broke the monotony. Egyptian festivals meant processions of divine statues, music, feasts, sometimes days off work. The gods came out of their temples to visit the people, carried on the shoulders of priests. Food, drink, dancing, it was religious obligation, but also a rare chance to breed. In Greece, festivals like the Panathenaea turned daily life upside down. Athenians paraded through the city, offered sacrifices, hosted games and performances. The gods demanded devotion, but at least they knew how to throw a party. Here's the irony. The very system that worked you to the bone also gave you these communal blowouts. The same Pharaoh who taxed your harvest into dust paraded the gods through your streets so you could clap and cheer. The same Olympians who starved your fields if they felt snubbed gave you holidays filled with wine and drama. Divine authority wasn't just whip and chain, it was carrot and cake. A hard bargain, sure, but one that kept the machine running. Let's walk into the home for a minute, because divine authority didn't just live in temples or on battlefields. It crawled right into your mud brick walls. An Egyptian household wasn't just a family space, it was a microcosm of cosmic order. The way your house was built, the shrines tucked into the corners, even the way you swept your floor, it was all tied to keeping Ma'at intact. And forget privacy. These homes weren't sprawling villas unless you were elite. For most people, it was cramped rooms, smoky air from clay ovens, reed mats instead of beds, and constant noise from neighbors crammed into the same cluster of houses. But there, tucked in the corner, was the little household shrine. Maybe a clay figure of Bes, the dwarf god with a lion's mane who scared away evil spirits. Or Taweret, the pregnant hippo goddess, guardian of childbirth. Imagine living in a space where every shadow might hide illness or misfortune, and the only protection was a squat figurine glaring at you from the shelf. The gods weren't abstract. They sat in your living room. Family life in Greece looked different, but carried the same divine stamp. Greek houses often revolved around a courtyard, with men's spaces, the andron, and women's quarters, the gynekon. Gender segregation wasn't just social convention, it was reinforced by divine narratives. Zeus had decreed the hierarchy. Athena modeled female virtue for some, while Hera set the example for jealous wives. Even your domestic squabbles could be justified by divine precedent. Your husband was an oaf? Well, look at Zeus. Your wife was sharp-tongued, just like Hera. Divine authority wasn't just about temples, it shaped the walls of your marriage. And speaking of women, daily life under divine rule hit them differently. In Egypt, women had more legal rights than many ancient societies. They could own property, initiate divorce, conduct business. But don't be fooled. Their value was still often tied to fertility, and childbirth was perilous. Infant mortality was high, maternal death common, and every pregnancy was treated as a spiritual gamble. That's why Taweret and Bes weren't just cute figurines. They were survival necessities. Women muttered spells during labor, wore amulets, offered prayers, because in their eyes, survival wasn't biology, it was divine favor. In Greece, women's rights were far more limited. In Athens, they couldn't vote, couldn't hold property independently, unless you were a widow in rare circumstances, and were expected to stay indoors, spinning wool, raising children, and performing household rituals. Their link to the divine was through roles as priestesses or through domestic worship. And again, childbirth was a brutal gauntlet. Artemis was invoked as protector, but also capricious. Sometimes she helped, sometimes she killed in childbirth. Imagine lying on a mat in labor, clutching a charm, knowing your survival depended not just on your body, but on whether Artemis woke up in a merciful mood. Children, of course, were another story. In Egypt, they were gifts from the gods, but also mouths to feed in an already precarious household economy. Little ones often ran around naked until puberty, with their heads shaved except for a side lock of youth, marking them under the gods' protection. Childhood was playful, yes, but short. By 10 or 12, you were already working in the fields or helping in the workshop. Divine order didn't wait for you to grow up. In Greece, childhood was similarly short-lived. Infants not wanted or deemed too weak were sometimes exposed, left to die or be taken as slaves. That harsh decision was wrapped in divine logic, fate, the will of the gods, necessity. For those who survived, boys were groomed for citizenship or military service, and girls were groomed for marriage. At age 7, Spartan boys were snatched into the agoge, trained to be warriors, whipped, starved, toughened like iron. And this brutality wasn't considered cruelty, it was sacred duty, aligning with Sparta's divine destiny under Ares. Imagine growing up knowing your bruises were a gift to the gods. Let's not forget clothing, because even what you wore was touched by divine hands. Egyptian linen, light and breathable, wasn't just about surviving the heat, it was purity. White linen was sacred, worn in temples, tied to ritual cleanliness. Priests shaved their bodies to avoid lice and bathed constantly, not just for hygiene, but as acts of holiness. Daily life was a performance of purity for the gods. Meanwhile, most commoners wore the same outfit day in and day out, patched until threadbare, yet still tied to that symbolic connection with divine order. Greeks wrapped themselves in chitons and himatians, simple draped cloths that could be adjusted for function or flair. Fashion wasn't about designer labels, it was about signaling virtue, modesty, or status. And don't think divine authority stayed out of this. Athena, goddess of weaving, was behind every loom, watching every thread. Women weaving in their homes weren't just making clothes, they were participating in a sacred act, echoing the myths where gods and mortals squared off over a shuttle and loom. Just ask Arachne how that contest turned out. Spoiler, it didn't end well for the mortal. And even hairstyles and cosmetics were divine business. Egyptians lined their eyes with kohl, not only for style or sun protection, but also to ward off evil spirits. Makeup was magical armor, a way of keeping demons at bay. Greeks oiled their bodies, curled their hair, wore garlands, all with nods to gods of beauty and love. Looking good wasn't vanity, it was piety. Aphrodite smiled on the well-groomed. Neglect yourself, and you risked divine disdain. Every aspect of daily life, from the sweat on your brow to the sandals on your feet, was threaded with divine expectation. You didn't just live, you lived under watchful eyes. every choice echoing through the cosmic balance sheet. And the scariest part, the gods weren't fair accountants. They were moody, temperamental, and often just plain cruel. But you had no choice. You ate, dressed, burst, farmed, fought, and slept under divine authority, hoping to scrape by with enough favor to survive another day. Now, let's take a break from the endless grind of farming, childbirth, and tax collectors breathing down your neck and talk about leisure. Because yes, even under divine authority, people found ways to relax. But here's the thing, even downtime wasn't free from the gods' meddling. Entertainment was never just for fun. It was always infused with ritual, symbolism, or divine oversight. Start in Egypt. Picture a hot afternoon along the Nile. Common folks might grab a board game. Senet, the favorite pastime for centuries. It wasn't just dice and strategy. It carried religious overtones. The board represented the journey of the soul through the afterlife. Every move, every piece sliding forward was symbolically tied to your soul's passage toward eternal bliss or annihilation. Imagine trying to chill with your friends, but every game you play doubles as a rehearsal for Judgment Day. Relaxing? Not exactly, but fun enough to keep you occupied. Music and dance also filled Egyptian life. Harps, lutes, flutes, drums, they played at banquets, in temples, on the streets. Yet again, these weren't just jam sessions. Music was sacred. Hathor, goddess of love and joy, was the patroness of music and dance, and her festivals were filled with rhythmic clapping, sistrum shaking, and women dancing until the line between worship and party blurred completely. Pleasure wasn't secular, it was a form of devotion. Even your dancing body was another offering to the gods. Meanwhile in Greece, leisure took on a louder, more competitive edge. The Olympics weren't simply athletic events, they were holy festivals dedicated to Zeus. Running, wrestling, chariot racing, all framed as acts of worship. Victors didn't just win glory for themselves, they honored their city and paid tribute to the divine. Even stripped naked, slicked in oil and throwing discus, athletes weren't just flexing, they were participating in a cosmic celebration. And every 4 years, the world stopped for it. Wars paused, truces declared, because the games were bigger than politics. They were divine business. But the Greeks didn't stop there. Theater was another form of sacred leisure. Tragedies and comedies performed at festivals like the Dionysia weren't just plays. They were offerings to Dionysus. Imagine thousands of Athenians crammed into a theater, watching actors in masks scream, cry, or crack jokes, knowing the performance wasn't just entertainment, it was ritual. The audience wasn't only enjoying drama, they were communing with the divine. Even laughter, even sorrow became sacred acts. And what about drinking? the Greek symposium took this to a whole new level. You reclined on couches, passed around wine diluted with water, and debated philosophy, politics, or poetry, while flutes played in the background. But don't think this was just a frat party with Socrates in the corner. The symposium was heavily ritualized. Libations to the gods opened the night, and Dionysus was the uninvited guest of honor at every bowl of wine. The balance between order and chaos, wisdom and drunkenness was always on the edge, because with Dionysus, you never knew when the party might spiral into madness. Egyptians had their own drinking culture too, though less philosophical and more survival-oriented. Beer fueled workers, yes, but during festivals it also flowed like a flood. Take the Festival of Drunkenness, held in honor of Sekhmet. The myth went that Sekhmet once got so bloodthirsty she nearly wiped out humanity until the gods tricked her into drinking dyed beer she thought was blood. She passed out, humanity survived, and the festival reenacted this by, what else? Getting blackout drunk. Imagine calling in sick the next day and telling your boss, "Sorry, but Sekhmet demanded I obliterate myself last night." Divine authority made your hangover holy. Games, drinking, theater, sports. These weren't just distractions. They were release valves in societies where divine power loomed over every harvest, every birth, every battle. Festivals gave ordinary people rare moments of joy, but always wrapped in religious obligation. You didn't just play or drink for yourself. You did it for Ra, for Dionysus, for the fragile order of the cosmos. Even your laughter echoed in the temples. But let's not forget the darker side of divine-infused leisure, blood sport. In Greece, animal sacrifices could look like mass slaughters, hundreds of cattle bellowing before the knife, blood spilling for Zeus. The feast after was joyous, sure, but the smell of charred meat was also a reminder of divine hunger. And while Egypt didn't have gladiatorial contests like later Rome, they did have ritualized displays of violence, mock battles, wrestling matches, ceremonial hunts. These acted as controlled chaos, offerings of sweat and blood to appease divine cravings. And so, even in play, the Gaunts kept their hands firmly on the dice. You might dance, drink, laugh, or gamble, but the Gaunts always got the first cut. Leisure wasn't escape. It was another way of feeding the divine machine. And deep down, you probably knew it. That Senate board in your lap, that amphora of wine, they weren't just for you. They were cosmic performance pieces, staged in your living room, in the theater, or in the festival square. Because under divine authority, even joy had to bow to heaven. Let's peel back the curtain on crime and punishment, because nothing reveals divine authority's teeth like how it handled people who stepped out of line. Forget modern courts and legal codes backed by human rights. In both Egypt and Greece, the law wasn't just law. It was cosmic mandate, divine will in action. Break it, and you weren't just a criminal. You were an enemy of the gods. Start with Egypt. The entire legal system was based on Ma'at, that fragile balance of truth, justice, and order. Pharaoh didn't just rule, he embodied Ma'at. So when you stole grain or cheated a neighbor, you weren't simply breaking civil law, you were chipping away at cosmic order. That meant punishment wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about restoring harmony to the universe. And trust me, the punishments had no chill. Thieves could have their noses cut off, adulterers might be beaten to death, corrupt officials mutilated or executed. Justice was public, theatrical, and dripping with divine symbolism. But here's the kicker. Because Pharaoh was divine, his judgment was beyond appeal. Imagine living in a world where the Supreme Court judge was also the sun god's chosen child. No petitions, no lawyers, no innocent until proven guilty. If Pharaoh or his appointed officials said you were guilty, that was the end of the story. And the sentence wasn't just earthly, it haunted your soul in the afterlife. A corrupt official might not only be punished in life, but also cursed to wander the underworld, denied of the bliss they craved. The gods made sure justice was eternal. Now swing over to Greece, and the picture gets messier. Greek city-states were fiercely proud of their legal systems. Athens especially, with its juries of hundreds of citizens shouting their verdicts. But don't mistake democracy for secularism. Laws were still rooted in divine will. Oaths were sworn to the gods. Temples oversaw sacred spaces of justice, and divine wrath was always lurking as a higher enforcement mechanism. Perjury wasn't just lying, it was tempting Zeus to strike you down. Theft from a temple wasn't just robbery, it was sacrilege and usually carried the death penalty. And the punishments, brutal. Exile was common. You'd be banished, cut off from your polis, effectively socially dead. Execution wasn't unheard of, though Athenians liked to dress it up with ritual. Think hemlock for Socrates, a calm and orderly death in service of the gods' justice. But for more ordinary criminals, thieves, murderers, traitors, the punishments could be savage: whippings, shackles, torture. And don't forget atimia, stripping someone of their civic rights, essentially turning them into a walking ghost in their own city. Divine authority wasn't subtle, it was humiliation dressed as cosmic payback. And here's something chilling. Collective punishment was a thing. In both cultures, your crime could stain your family. In Egypt, a corrupt scribe might see his children stripped of inheritance because his betrayal polluted the bloodline. In Greece, treason could mean not only your death, but also your house demolished, your name erased from public memory. The logic was divine contagion. Sin infected not just you, but everyone tied to you. Harsh, but consistent with the gods' own style of collective tantrums. Remember when Zeus or Ra got angry? Whole populations suffered. Mortals just copied the pattern. But let's step out of the courtroom and into the street. Policing wasn't modern, but the gods still had their enforcers. In Egypt, temple officials doubled as law keepers. Priests weren't just spiritual guides, they were bureaucrats, judges, sometimes even executioners. Imagine confessing your sins to a man who could both absolve you and have you flogged. Divine authority had no separation of powers. It was one giant tangle. In Greece, enforcement was even weirder. Athens had public slaves who acted as a kind of proto-police force. Yes, slaves enforcing laws on citizens. Their authority wasn't in their status, but in the divine-backed system they represented. If you resisted them, you weren't just resisting a man. You were resisting the law of the gods that underpinned the polis. And don't forget public shaming as a weapon. Criminals could be paraded, humiliated, branded, or left on display as warnings. Egypt might plaster inscriptions denouncing traitors, while Greece sometimes literally erased their names from records, as if annihilating them from memory also annihilated their soul. Forget fines. Erasure was worse than death because it struck at immortality. But maybe the cruelest punishment wasn't physical at all. It was spiritual. In Egypt, the ultimate terror was being denied proper burial rites. Without mummification, without the correct rituals, your soul wandered eternally, restless and damned. Executed criminals sometimes had their bodies mutilated or discarded to ensure this eternal torment. In Greece, exile carried the same sting. Cut off from your city, your gods, your ancestors, you were spiritually homeless. To ancient minds, this was a fate worse than death, and the gods were the ones handing down the stamp of approval. So crime and punishment weren't just civic matters, they were divine theater. Every sentence carried the weight of heaven. Every act of justice was a performance meant to restore cosmic order. And what does that say about daily life under divine authority? That even your mistakes, your accidents, your petty grievances were magnified into cosmic offenses. The scale was stacked, the punishments merciless, and the gods never missed a chance to remind you who was really in charge. If you thought divine authority only flexed its muscles in courtrooms and temples, think bigger, literally. We're stepping into the land of stone, marble, and monuments so massive they basically scream, "The gods are watching, and you'd better behave." Architecture wasn't just civic utility, it was theology written in granite. Take Egypt. The pyramids are the obvious showstoppers. Geometric sermons in limestone, towering over the desert like eternal reminders that Pharaoh was both king and god. These weren't just fancy tombs. They were propaganda on a scale so colossal, it still makes modern skyscrapers look insecure. Each block whispered, "Pharaoh bends men and stone alike to divine will." And when those blocks reached their peak, they formed stairways to the heavens. Pharaoh didn't just die, He ascended on ramps of cosmic geometry, leaving the rest of humanity groveling in his shadow. But the pyramids were just the opening act. Temples, oh, the temples, were the real centers of divine authority. Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, every column, every relief was a manifesto. Walk into Karnak, and you're swallowed by a forest of stone pillars that make you feel like an ant. That was the point. Scale was a theological weapon. If your god's house dwarfed you, then so did the god's authority. And Pharaoh, strutting through those colonnades in ritual regalia, wasn't just king. He was the high priest, the mediator, the man who could summon the sun. Every festival, every procession carved that message deeper into the collective psyche. And if the Egyptians mastered intimidation through permanence, the Greeks weaponized beauty. The Parthenon on the Acropolis wasn't just a temple, it was Athens itself, crystallized in marble and proportion. Dedicated to Athena, patron goddess of the city, it was both an offering and a claim. The gods chose us. We're divine favorites. Bow down. Every triglyph, every frieze of gods mingling with mortals was propaganda in 3D. The artistry whispered that divine order and human achievement weren't opposites. They were one seamless fabric. But here's the sneaky part. These monuments weren't just for the gods. They were for the people. Citizens and foreigners alike saw them daily, absorbing the message. Our laws are sacred, our rulers chosen, our gods invincible. Divine authority didn't just punish, it seduced, dazzled, hypnotized. Imagine being a farmer from some dusty Greek village, trudging up to Athens and seeing the Parthenon glowing in the sun. You'd believe the gods truly lived there. You'd accept your place in the order without question. And don't think the ancients didn't know this was propaganda. They leaned into it hard. Ramses II, master of self-promotion, carved his face on temples from Nubia to the Delta like a cosmic celebrity influencer, plastering his selfies everywhere. Abu Simbel, that wasn't a temple, it was a billboard announcing to anyone sailing the Nile, this land belongs to the gods and I am their chosen hammer. Same in Greece. Athens used the Delian League treasury, read other city-states' money, to build the Parthenon, turning tribute into marble theology. You weren't just conquered, you were spiritually overpowered. And then there were inscriptions. Oh, the inscriptions. Walls, stelae, obelisks, all carved with endless lines of hieroglyphs or Greek text praising gods and kings. Most people couldn't read, but they didn't need to. The very presence of divine writing carved into unyielding stone screamed permanence. Gods spoke here, and their words would outlast your grandchildren's grandchildren. Literacy wasn't required. Awe was. But architecture wasn't just about scale or beauty. It was ritual in stone. Egyptian temples were designed as cosmic microcosms. You'd move from the open sunlight of the courtyard into progressively darker, narrower halls, until finally reaching the sanctum sanctorum, where the god statue resided. The journey mirrored the act of approaching divinity, from the human world into the sacred unknown. Ordinary citizens never got that far. The inner rooms were reserved for priests and pharaoh, but even being excluded reinforced the hierarchy. The gods were near, but access to them was tightly controlled. The Greeks loved a good ritual space too. Theaters, for example, weren't just entertainment venues. They were sacred precincts. Performances of tragedies and comedies were religious acts dedicated to Dionysus. Watching Oedipus blind himself wasn't just theater. It was spiritual catharsis sanctioned by the gods. And stadiums. The Olympic Games weren't about personal glory. They were offerings to Zeus, proof that even athletic sweat dripped in divine service. So let's not kid ourselves. Monumental architecture wasn't neutral. It was a weaponized extension of divine authority. Stone wasn't just stone. It was ideology, embodied and eternal. The gods didn't just live in heaven. They lived in pylons, colonnades, and marble facades. Step inside, and you weren't just a visitor. You were a participant in a ritualized lesson. The gods are great. The rulers are chosen. And you are small. And here's the final kicker. It worked. Thousands of years later, we're still standing in front of these ruins, slack-jawed and reverent. Divine authority may have been a construct, but when you build your theology out of stone and mathematics, it leaves scars that time can't erase. The gods might have gone quiet, but their architecture still whispers. Let's pull back from stone and monuments for a moment and talk about the rhythm of belief itself, the rituals, the festivals, the endless choreography of devotion that glued society together. Because in a world where gods weren't just metaphors, but your landlords, tax collectors, and meteorologists rolled into one, ritual wasn't optional. It was survival. Start with Egypt. Religion there was a daily performance, not a once-a-week affair. Every sunrise, priests at major temples would wake the gods. Picture it, dawn breaking over the Nile, and inside Karnak, a team of priests enters the sanctuary. They light incense, bathe the statue of Amun-Ra, dress it in fresh linen, and present it with food offerings. This wasn't symbolic, it was literal. The god's essence resided in that statue. Neglect the ritual, and you weren't just skipping chores. You were letting the sun falter, the Nile dry up, and chaos creep back into the world. Priests weren't clergy in the modern sense. They were cosmic maintenance workers, keeping the gears of the universe greased with incense smoke and bread loaves. And then there were festivals, which were essentially state-sponsored spiritual block parties. The Opet Festival in Thebes. Imagine hauling the statue of Amun, along with Mut and Kansu, down the Nile from Karnak to Luxor, and barges adorned with gold and banners, while thousands of citizens lined the banks cheering. It was sacred, yes, but it was also spectacle, music, dancing, drinking, food stalls. For the people, it was their one chance to see the god leave the inner sanctuary and pass by in glory. That glimpse alone was enough to recharge their faith for another year. Now pivot to Greece. Festivals were the backbone of civic and religious life, a constant carousel of honoring whichever god was in season. The Panathenaic festival in Athens, dedicated to Athena, was part religious devotion, part civic pride, part parade. Processions carried sacred garments to the Acropolis, while citizens feasted, raced, and competed in contests. Religion wasn't a private, solemn affair. It was loud, colorful, and profoundly communal. But the Greeks took ritualized spectacle to Olympic levels, literally. The Olympic Games weren't just about muscle flexing. They were offerings to Zeus, held in his sanctuary at Olympia. Athletes swore oaths before competing. Sacrifices filled the altars, and victories were framed as divine favor, not just personal glory. Winning meant Zeus himself had smiled on you. Imagine if every modern Olympic medal was handed out by a priest while a cow was slaughtered in the background to seal the deal. That was the vibe. Theater, too, was pure ritual. The Dionysia in Athens. Citizens gathered in vast theaters carved into hillsides, watching tragedies and comedies performed as acts of worship. Playwrights weren't just artists, they were priests of emotion, channeling catharsis for the community. Think about it. Oedipus blinding himself wasn't simply drama. It was a collective religious experience, watched by thousands under the gaze of Dionysus. Even laughter in a comedy wasn't profane. It was sacred release, sanctioned by the wine god himself. And then came sacrifices, the ever-present drumbeat of divine appeasement. Greeks and Egyptians alike slaughtered animals, burned offerings, poured libations. For the Greeks, the altar was the true heart of the temple, not the inner chamber. Flames, smoke, and blood rising skyward, physical proof the gods were being fed. For Egyptians, daily offerings of bread, beer, meat, and fruit to temple statues weren't symbolic meals. The gods consumed their spiritual essence, leaving the leftovers for the priests, who were basically living on divine leftovers every day. Imagine telling your kids, yes, we're eating last night's divine snack box. It's blessed. Don't complain. But rituals weren't all grand festivals and temple feasts. They bled into daily life, shaping the routines of ordinary people. An Egyptian farmer might leave a little beer on his ancestors' tomb to keep them happy. A Greek housewife might sprinkle barley at the household altar before cooking. A soldier heading into battle poured a quick libation on the ground for Ares, just in case. You didn't need a priest to remind you that the gods were everywhere. Your day-to-day actions kept that belief alive, thread by thread. And woven into all this was spectacle, because divine authority thrived on visibility. The gods didn't want you to believe quietly in your heart. They wanted your faith loud, public, unavoidable. Festivals transformed whole cities into stage sets for divine theater. Sacrifices filled the air with the smell of roasting flesh. Priests in gleaming robes carried statues on golden litters. Everything about ritual was designed to hammer home the same message. You live under divine eyes, and you'd better act like it. It's easy to imagine some cynics in the crowd rolling their eyes at yet another procession. But skepticism rarely won in societies where ritual was everywhere. You didn't need to believe wholeheartedly. You just needed to participate. Belief wasn't the fuel. Participation was. You bowed, you danced, you poured, you feasted, and in doing so, you reinforced the system, whether your heart was in it or not. And that's the genius of divine authority. It turned ritual into habit, habit into culture, and culture into a prison you decorated yourself. If public festivals and temple ceremonies were the booming drums of divine authority, then daily piety was the background hum, a constant low-level soundtrack in every home, every street, every breath. Because let's be real, most people weren't hobnobbing with priests in Karnak or sitting front row at the theater of Dionysus. They were hauling water, baking bread, patching roofs, and trying to survive. And in that grind, the gods were everywhere. Start with the Egyptians. Their houses weren't empty shells, they were micro-temples. Small clay or wooden statues of protective deities like Best, the dwarf god of childbirth and laughter, or Tauret, the hippo goddess of fertility, stood guard over bedrooms and kitchens. Bes was squat, ugly, bearded, and often sticking out his tongue. Basically the world's first meme face, but his grotesque charm was his power. He scared off demons, snakes, and nightmares. A child got sick, call Bes. A woman was giving birth. Put a Tauret amulet under the bed. Ordinary Egyptians didn't just worship Ra in the sky. They built little divine security systems into their homes. Amulets were everywhere. Scarabs, ankhs, eyes of Horus. They dangled from necks, wrists, and even burial wrappings. They weren't fashion statements. They were spiritual insurance policies. The Eye of Horus protected against the evil eye. Scarabs symbolized rebirth. Ankhs promised life. Every trinket was a contract with the unseen. Lose your amulet, and suddenly you weren't just underdressed, you were cosmically exposed. And superstition didn't end at the front door. Egyptians carried spells into the fields. Farmers might mutter charms over irrigation ditches, hoping to keep crocodiles away. Fishermen carved protective symbols on their boats. Even scribes, the intellectual elite, weren't above scratching out protective prayers at the top of papyrus scrolls, as if Ra himself needed to proofread their work. daily life was drenched in divine paranoia. The Greeks weren't much different, though their pantheon was more volatile. Where Egyptians leaned on protective gods, Greeks leaned on appeasement. You didn't just cross a river, you tossed in a coin or poured out some wine for the local river spirit, because what if it got offended and drowned you? Traveling meant dropping little offerings at roadside herms, stone pillars with Hermes' head, and yes, an erect phallus carved on them. Imagine living in a world where even the traffic signs were sacred, and flipping one off could bring divine road rage. Greek households had hearth cults too. Every fire wasn't just fire. It was Hestia's flame, the sacred core of family life. Meals began with offerings, little scraps tossed into the fire for the gods. Bread baked wasn't just food, it was a tiny altar. Even garbage disposal could get spiritual. Toss something in the street, and you might whisper a charm to avoid offending wandering spirits. The spiritual economy never stopped. Then came curses, the darker flip side of piety. Greeks especially loved curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with names and hexes, rolled up and buried in wells, graves, or sanctuaries. Want your business rival ruined? Write his name, bind it with a plea to underworld gods, and toss it into the earth. Want your lover back? Scribble an erotic curse and beg the spirits of the dead to inflame her desire. It was petty, personal, and profoundly popular. Religion wasn't just collective, it was weaponized for individual grievances. Imagine if every time you had workplace drama, you filed your complaint not with HR but with Hades. And don't forget dreams. Both Egyptians and Greeks believed the divine slipped messages into your sleep. Egyptians even built dream books, manuals decoding what your visions meant. Dream of eating crocodile meat? Congratulations, you'll soon be powerful. Dream of losing teeth? Uh-oh, family trouble ahead. The Greeks institutionalized it. Sick? Don't just see a doctor, sleep in the sanctuary of Asclepius. Priests would interpret your dreams as divine prescriptions. Medicine and magic weren't separate, they were entwined in the sheets of your bed. What ties it all together is the sheer inescapability. You couldn't walk out the door, take a breath, or scratch an itch without brushing against divine paranoia. It wasn't about choice. You didn't get to see, I'm not religious. That wasn't a category. Belief was baked into action, and action was constant. Light a fire, drop a coin, wear an amulet, whisper a charm. Fail to do it, and you weren't just careless. You were reckless with cosmic forces. And here's the irony. All these small rituals weren't about confidence in the gods. They were about insecurity. Nobody trusted the gods to be stable. Egyptians feared chaos, Isfet, always lurking. Greeks feared temper tantrums from Olympus. So you layered charms, prayers, and curses over your life like padding, hoping to cushion the blow when divine lightning inevitably struck. It's easy for us to look back and laugh at amulets and curse tablets, but in their world, they weren't irrational. They were practical tools, in the same way we keep smoke alarms or carry insurance. Only instead of protecting against fire or theft, they protected against cosmic rot. And when you live under divine authority, paranoia isn't superstition, it's common sense. If ordinary people kept the gods satisfied, with amulets, charms, and muttered prayers, then the priestly class were the real managers of the divine enterprise. Think of them as cosmic middle management. They didn't own the company, that was the gods. They weren't the flashy CEO, that was the king or pharaoh. But they controlled access to the boss. And in societies where the boss could ruin the harvest or send a plague, gatekeeping the divine was the ultimate power move. In Egypt, priests weren't just a handful of robe wearers chanting in the dark. They were an entire bureaucracy, a parallel state nested inside the state. The great temples, Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, weren't only sacred spaces. They were banks, granaries, schools, and economic hubs, all run by priests. Land belonged to the temples. Farms were worked by tenants who paid their rent in grain. And who collected that grain? Priests. Who distributed during famine? Priests again. In many ways, Pharaoh might wear the crown, but priests held the purse strings of divine favor. And don't picture them as ascetic hermits living in spiritual poverty. Egyptian priests rotated in and out of service, often spending only part of the year inside temple duties. The rest of the time, they lived as wealthy landowners, merchants, or scribes. Service to the gods was lucrative. You had access to offerings, temple surpluses, and the prestige that came with being an intermediary. Want the gods to hear your prayer? Too bad. You can't just waltz into the sanctuary. Only the priests can take your offerings behind the veil, and you have to trust they'll pass the message along. Divine authority funneled through human hands, and those hands weren't free. And if Pharaoh was supposed to be the high priest of every god, the practical reality was that no one man could possibly perform all the daily rituals across Egypt. Priests stepped in, performing the literal feeding, bathing, and clothing of statues on behalf of the divine king. In that sense, priests propped up the entire illusion of Pharaoh's godhood. They made his cosmic job description function. Which begs the question, who really held the power? The god king? Or the guys who kept the gods alive every morning with a bath and breakfast? The Greeks had their own priestly networks, though theirs looked a little less centralized and a lot more opportunistic. Greek priests weren't career-long clerics. Often they were appointed annually, sometimes even by lot, which meant you could be a farmer one year and suddenly find yourself managing the cult of Apollo the next. But don't let that sound casual. It was a golden ticket. Priests were entitled to portions of sacrificial meat, fees for rituals, and public prestige. And if you landed in a major sanctuary, say Delphi or Olympia, you were suddenly operating at the intersection of politics and divinity. Take the oracle at Delphi. The Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, sat on her tripod inhaling fumes, likely ethylene gas seeping from the earth, and muttering prophecies. But those cryptic babbles weren't passed directly to supplicants. Oh no. Priests were the translators, the editors, the spin doctors. They turned garbled syllables into polished verse, conveniently ambiguous enough to be right, no matter the outcome. Croesus of Lydia asks if he should invade Persia. The oracle replies, If you cross the river, a great empire will fall. He does. His own empire collapses. Technically, the oracle wasn't wrong. Priestly ambiguity was divine insurance, and they wielded it like masters. And oracles weren't free. You brought offerings, money, sometimes whole delegations with lavish gifts, just for a chance at Apollo's enigmatic words. Priests pocketed the resources, sanctuaries grew rich, and the gods, through their human mouthpieces, became power brokers in international politics. In that way, religion wasn't just faith, it was foreign policy. Even at the household level, priests inserted themselves. Want to sacrifice a goat? Sure, you could do it yourself, but if you wanted it done properly, to ensure the gods actually accepted it, you paid a priest. They knew the right words, the right cuts, the right way to burn the thigh bones wrapped in fat, so the smoke curled skyward. Divine attention was fickle, so outsourcing to professionals was a safer bet. And if the professionals got rich in the process, well, that was just proof the gods smiled on them. But here's the kicker. Priests everywhere claimed humility while building empires of wealth and influence. Egyptian temples rivaled Pharaoh in landholding. Greek sanctuaries like Delphi or Olympia amassed treasure from across the Mediterranean. Divine authority flowed downward from the heavens, but it pooled heavily in the hands of priests who decided how to channel it. They were custodians, interpreters, and often manipulators. Without them, the system collapsed, and the people knew it. They might mutter charms in their homes or carve curse tablets in secret, but when it came to the big stuff, fertility of the land, victory in war, justice in disputes, they had no choice but to turn to priests. The priests had the keys, literally and figuratively, to the sanctuaries, the rituals, and the gods themselves. Divine authority may have been cosmic, but it was administered like a business franchise. And the priests, they were middlemen who learned to skim very, very well. Money makes the world go round, but in the ancient world, it was grain, cattle, and temple wealth that made divine authority tick. Because gods may have been immortal, but their earthly operations needed funding. And who footed the bill? You, of course. Ordinary people paid in offerings, taxes, and labor, while temples turned faith into one of the most efficient economic machines in history. Let's start in Egypt, where temples weren't just places of prayer, they were economic black holes, sucking in tribute and never letting it go. The Temple of Amun at Karnak owned sprawling fields, fleets of boats, workshops, and armies of workers. At its height, the temple complex controlled a third of all arable land in Egypt. That's not a church collection plate. That's Amazon levels of monopoly. Every loaf of bread baked for ritual, every ox slaughtered for sacrifice, every bolt of linen woven for the god statue came from temple estates, worked by farmers who often didn't see much return. You didn't just pay your taxes to Pharaoh, you also paid your rent to the gods, enforced by priests who had as much economic clout as nobles. And don't be fooled into thinking offerings were symbolic. They were tangible and very real. Grain, wine, honey, incense, cattle, gold. Priests presented them to statues, then claimed the gods only consumed their essence. The leftovers, those went straight into temple stores or the stomachs of priests. Imagine tithing your best sheep, only to watch the clergy host a barbecue with it later. Religion doubled as a supply chain, one that kept priests fat and temples wealthy. Now shift to Greece, where sanctuaries became banks, literally. Temples like those at Delphi and Olympia weren't just places for worship. They were safe houses for treasure. City-states deposited war booty, diplomatic gifts, and tribute there, trusting divine protection to guard their wealth. The Parthenon itself housed the Delian League treasury, which was supposed to fund mutual defense against Persia, but instead got siphoned off by Athens to build marble temples and golden statues. Picture NATO's defense budget being stored in a church, then accidentally used for interior decorating. That was Athens in the 5th century BCE. And offerings, oh, they poured in. Gold tripods, silver balls, life-sized bronze statues, all heaped up in sanctuaries. The treasury of Delphi glittered with dedications from kings, tyrants, and city-states, all eager to curry Apollo's favor. And the priests weren't above dipping into the pile when times got tight. Sacred treasure was a cushion of power, wealth disguised as piety. But here's where it gets interesting. Temples created jobs. Artisans, stonemasons, sculptors, and scribes all worked under temple patronage. Every pyramid, every colossal statue, every golden cult image was an ancient stimulus package. Temples churned the economy, keeping workers busy and craft traditions alive. The gods demanded splendor, and the human economy hummed along trying to deliver it. You might not benefit directly, but you couldn't deny the ripple effect. Divine authority didn't just command worship, it commissioned payroll. And then there were taxes. Pharaohs levied them not just in the name of the state, but in the name of the gods. Grain levies filled temple granaries, where scribes meticulously recorded every sack. Miss a payment, and you weren't just cheating the government, you were cheating the cosmos. Imagine the IRS showing up at your door with a priest in tow, reminding you that Ra is also very disappointed in your bookkeeping. The Greeks were subtler, but no less exploitative. Sacrifices required animals, and animals weren't free. Cattle, goats, pigs. If you wanted to honor Zeus properly, you shelled out. And if you couldn't afford a cow, well, maybe a chicken. But the hierarchy was obvious. The rich paraded oxen and dined on roasted meat. The poor brought scraps and hoped the gods weren't offended. Even religion was stratified. The gods got fed regardless, but how much you offered determined how much favor you expected back. It was a divine pay-to-play system. But nothing shows the monetization of divine authority better than oracles. People flocked from across the Mediterranean to hear Apollo's word at Delphi, and nobody walked in empty-handed. Delegations brought treasure, cities sent monuments, individuals brought offerings. The line between spiritual consultation and financial transaction blurred until they were practically the same thing. The gods didn't just demand faith, they demanded a down payment. And let's not forget the labor tax, corvée work demanded by the state and temples alike. Egyptians hauled blocks, dug canals, and harvested fields for Pharaoh, which really meant for the gods. Even if you weren't handing over grain, your sweat was an offering. The Nile's rhythms weren't just natural, they were weaponized by temple economics, turning surplus labor into monuments that screamed divine supremacy. At the heart of it all was a brutal equation. Divine authority required spectacle, and spectacle required money. Temples became vaults, priests became financiers, and ordinary people became the endless fuel for the machine. Faith was the currency, but actual currency, grain, gold, livestock, kept the gods' earthly kingdoms alive. And here's the bitter truth. When you tithed, sacrificed, or paid tax, you weren't just giving to heaven. You were bankrolling the very system that kept you in your place. If divine authority touched your stomach, your taxes, and your work schedule, it also invaded something even more personal: gender roles. Because in societies where gods ruled, women were both sidelined and strangely elevated, depending on whether you were talking about mortals or divinities. And oh, the irony was rich. Take Egypt first. On the ground, most women lived highly structured, patriarchal lives. Marriages were arranged, childbearing was relentless, and household labor consumed their time. But climb a rung higher into the temple world, and suddenly you'd see women wielding roles that made them guardians of cosmic order. Priestesses weren't window dressing. They served as God's wives, chantresses, and adorers of the gods. The most famous of these, the god's wife of Amun, a title that effectively made her queen of Karnak's temple bureaucracy. In the New Kingdom, this role carried immense wealth, land, and influence, almost like a high priest in skirts. Picture being a nun who also happens to run half the church's property. Yeah, that level of paradox. And the goddess hierarchy was even more striking. While mortal women fetched water and baked bread, goddesses like Isis, Hathor, and Sekhmet embodied power, fertility, and divine wrath. Isis wasn't just a mother goddess, she was a political operator, worshipped far beyond Egypt, so famous that Roman emperors built temples for her. Hathor, the cow-eared goddess of love, also had a dangerous edge, doubling as the Eye of Ra, capable of unleashing divine destruction. Sekhmet, the lioness, was pure carnage personified, sent to massacre humanity when they stepped out of line. You wanted to keep her happy. Compare that with your average Egyptian woman kneeling in the dirt, grinding grain for hours a day. The divine female was ferocious and revered. The human female was practical and exhausted. Now hop over to Greece, where Olympian hypocrisy really shines. Mortal women, keep them indoors, spinning wool, raising kids, and staying silent in assemblies. The Athenian ideal of womanhood was so restrictive, it makes a modern prison sentence look like freedom. Yet the goddesses, they ruled Olympus. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war strategy, literally birthed herself from Zeus's head and spent her days outsmarting men. Artemis guarded her independence with a bow and arrow and zero patience for creeps. Hera, queen of the gods, may have been defined by marriage, but she was no docile housewife. Her vengeance was legendary, her temper volcanic. You can almost hear the bitter laughter of Athenian wives praying to Hera for justice while trapped in loveless marriages. The paradox deepens when you look at ritual. Women were excluded from politics, but they were indispensable in certain festivals. Take the Thesmophoria, a women-only fertility festival in Athens, where wives performed secret rituals for Demeter and Persephone. Men weren't even allowed to peek. For 3 days, women ran the show, honoring goddesses of agriculture with strange rites involving rotting piglets, fertility charms, and body jokes. Imagine housewives transforming into priestesses, if only temporarily, their voices echoing in sacred groves, while men nervously stayed away. For once, female bodies weren't just reproductive machines, they were the conduits of cosmic cycles. And here's the kicker. Divine femininity often terrified men. Male gods were powerful, but female gods, they were unpredictable. They could nurture life or obliterate it without warning. Dionysus, the god of wine, relied on female followers, the Maenads, whose frenzied dances blurred the line between ecstasy and violence. Euripides, Bacchae, dramatizes what happened when mortals underestimated them. They tore a man apart, limb by limb, in divine frenzy. The message was clear. Don't underestimate women when the gods are involved, even if you try to keep them out of the city council. Meanwhile, in Egypt, marriage contracts gave women surprising legal agency. They could own property, sue in court, and inherit wealth. Not exactly feminism, but still a far cry from the Greek model, where women were perpetual minors under male guardianship. And why? Because Egypt's mythology placed such emphasis on goddesses upholding Ma'at, the cosmic order, that female power couldn't be erased entirely. In a society obsessed with balance, women couldn't be written out, even if their daily lives were heavy with labor. But let's not romanticize too much. The priestess roles were rare, reserved for elites, and even goddess worship didn't erase the grind of childbirth, disease, and dependency for ordinary women. Daily life for most women, divine backdrop or not, meant aching backs, endless chores, and little political voice. The contrast between lofty statues of Isis and the hunched shoulders of a woman at the grindstone is enough to make you question how much divine femininity actually trickled down. Still, the pattern is unmistakable. Divine authority didn't erase gender inequality. It mirrored it, exaggerated it, and sometimes flipped it on its head. Women on earth served husbands and fathers, but women in the heavens ruled over gods themselves. And maybe that's why rituals gave mortal women occasional access to divine roles. They needed those glimpses, however fleeting, of power beyond the loom and cradle. Because in the end, whether you were a Greek housewife sneaking off to the Thesmophoria or an Egyptian priestess singing hymns in Karnak, your body and your gender weren't just personal. They were political. They were cosmic. They were tools in the divine machinery that claimed to order the world. Every empire needs soldiers, and every soldier needs a reason to fight. In the ancient world, that reason was often simple. The gods said so. Wars weren't waged merely for land or loot. They were cosmic struggles, divinely sanctioned clashes where every spear thrown and every city burned was framed as part of a higher plan. If you thought your commander was terrifying, try marching with the idea that Apollo or Amun himself was keeping score. In Egypt, Pharaoh didn't ride into battle as just another warlord. He was literally the arm of the gods on earth. When Ramesses II charged the Hittites at Kadesh, inscriptions portrayed him not as a man caught in a chaotic skirmish, but as a living embodiment of Ra's fury. Reliefs show him charging alone, arrows raining like divine lightning, his enemies scattering like insects. Reality, he barely escaped a tactical disaster. Propaganda, he was invincible because the gods rode with him. That wasn't just spin, it was a survival mechanism. Soldiers needed to believe their pharaoh was more than human, that even if their shields splintered and their brothers fell, cosmic order itself guaranteed their side would prevail. And let's not forget the rituals. Before campaigns, pharaohs performed offerings to secure divine favor. Temples mobilized resources for war, grain for the troops, prayers for victory, priests chanting at dawn while the army assembled. The battlefield wasn't just geography, it was an altar. Every fallen enemy was an offering. Every victory a confirmation that Ma'at, order, still triumphed over Isfit, chaos. You weren't killing for plunder. You were rebalancing the universe. The Greeks weren't much different, though their gods had a mischievous streak. Wars were always fought under the gaze of the gods, and every general knew better than to skip sacrifices before battle. The Spartans wouldn't even march until the omens were favorable. Imagine being ready to invade, swords sharpened, armor gleaming, adrenaline pumping, and then your general says, "Sorry lads, the goat's liver doesn't look right. Pack it up." That was normal. You didn't roll dice without checking with Zeus. But when the Greeks fought, they genuinely believed gods took sides. The Iliad isn't just poetry, it's a reflection of this worldview. Apollo literally shields Trojan warriors. Athena grabs spears mid-air, and Ares himself wades into combat. For mortals, this meant battlefield chaos wasn't just strategy, it was divine whimsy. If you died, maybe you'd annoyed Hera. If you lived, maybe Athena thought you were clever enough to save. The battlefield was a chessboard, and the gods were capricious players moving pawns at will. This wasn't just myth either. Historical battles carried the same flavor. At Marathon, Athenians claimed they saw the ghost of Theseus leading them. At Salamis, they swore the gods themselves whipped up winds to scatter the Persian fleet. Victory wasn't yours, it was theirs. You were just the instrument. And here's where divine warfare gets dark. Religion didn't just justify fighting, it demanded it. The Egyptians portrayed foreign enemies as embodiments of chaos, subhuman forces threatening divine order. To slaughter them wasn't brutality, it was ritual cleansing. Those neat little rows of bound captives carved into temple walls, they weren't just records of conquest, they were spiritual trophies, proof that Pharaoh was keeping chaos at bay. Each smiting scene wasn't just violence, it was theology carved in stone. The Greeks went one better. They made war a festival. Victories were celebrated with sacrifices, spoils dedicated in temples, and games held in honor of the gods. Kill, conquer, and then thank Zeus with 100 oxen. Cities boasted not just of their triumphs, but of the grand dedications they left behind. Statues, treasuries, entire sanctuaries built on the backs of war. Religion wrapped the gore in glory. The more you slaughtered, the bigger your offering, the more favor you claimed. It was a cycle of blood and faith that kept churning. And the soldiers themselves, they carried the gods with them. Amulets, charms, small figurines tucked into armor. These weren't trinkets, they were lifelines. An Egyptian soldier might carry a scarab with spells for protection. A Greek hoplite might scratch "Athena, protect me" onto his shield. Imagine the psychological weight, marching into a storm of spears and arrows, your only hope being that a goddess was paying attention to your personal prayer while managing 100,000 other requests. But divine authority also policed how war was fought. Some temples were off limits. Violating sanctuaries was a cosmic crime. Certain festivals meant truces, like the Olympic Games, which temporarily halted wars so athletes could compete under Zeus's gaze. For a few weeks, the gods declared, "Stop stabbing each other. Come wrestle instead." It didn't always work, but the principle mattered. Even war had to bend before divine order. And then there's the kicker. Defeat wasn't just political failure, it was theological collapse. If Pharaoh lost, it meant Maat trembled. If a Greek city was crushed, it meant their gods had abandoned them, maybe even switched sides. That's why captured temples were looted, cult statues stolen, sacred fires extinguished. Victory wasn't complete until you proved the enemy's gods were powerless. It was psychological warfare, written in stone and smoke. In short, war wasn't just a clash of men, it was a clash of cosmologies. Every battle was scripted as theater for divine audiences. Every casualty was a sacrifice, every triumph a hymn. And through it all, the gods weren't just watching, they were co-authors of the carnage. You'd think death would be the one escape hatch from taxes, toil, and divine micromanagement. Nope. In Egypt and Greece, the gods had rigged even the afterlife. You didn't just die, you transferred departments. Pharaoh might not be breathing down your neck anymore, but Osiris or Hades was waiting with an even longer rulebook. The divine bureaucracy was eternal. Start with Egypt. The afterlife was no gentle stroll through a sunny meadow. It was a cosmic customs office, and you better have your paperwork in order. Literally. Egyptians buried their dead with books of the dead, scrolls crammed with spells, passwords, and instructions on how to navigate the dangers of Duat, the underworld. Think of it as the ultimate travel guide. Chapter 72, How to Not Have Your Head Eaten by a Crocodile, Lion, Hippo Monster. You didn't wing it, you studied. And then came the ultimate audit, the weighing of the heart. Osiris, Lord of the Underworld, sat enthroned while your heart was weighed against the feather of Maat, cosmic truth. Too heavy with sin, Amut, the devourer, gobbled it up, and poof, your soul was annihilated. No appeal, no second chance. Imagine dying only to find yourself in a divine HR exit interview where failure means permanent deletion. The message was clear. Live by Maat, pay your offerings, follow the rituals, or risk eternal obliteration. The gods didn't just tax your grain, they taxed your conscience. And the process was expensive. To secure a good afterlife, you needed tomb goods, funerary statues, amulets, and elaborate burials. Coffins were inscribed with protective spells. Servant figurines called ushapti were buried with you to do your chores in the afterlife. Yes, you even outsourced labor beyond death. But all of it cost money. If you were rich, you could afford a pyramid or a rock-cut tomb. complete with wall paintings of banquets and fields of reeds where you'd party forever. If you were poor, maybe a reed mat and a pot of beer. Even eternity was class-based. Heaven was a gated community. Now flip to Greece, and the afterlife looks even grimmer. Hades wasn't a paradise. It was a bureaucratic waiting room. Everyone went down to the underworld, rich or poor, hero or beggar, and most of them shuffled as shades in gloom. The only way out, favor from the gods or heroic deeds. And even then, it cost you. To cross into the underworld, you needed Charon's ferry, and Charon didn't row for free. Families placed coins on the eyes or tongues of the dead to pay the fare. No coin, no passage. You'd wander the banks of the Styx forever, a ghost stuck at border control with no visa. And like the Egyptians, the Greeks weaponized ritual. The proper burial was a sacred duty, not optional. If your family didn't perform it, your soul was doomed to restlessness. That's why Greek tragedies obsess over burial rites. Deny someone their funeral, and you weren't just dishonoring them, you were condemning their spirit. Death was still social control, extending the grip of divine authority beyond the grave. Of course, the elites carved out their loopholes. Heroes and kings claimed spots in the Elysian fields, a kind of divine retirement villa for the chosen few. Poets spun tales of eternal feasts, green meadows, and blissful rest. But that wasn't for you, the average hoplite or farmer. Unless, of course, you bought into mystery cults. The Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a brighter afterlife, whispering secret rituals and hope of salvation. But initiates had to pay and perform the rites. Even the afterlife became a spiritual subscription service. And the gods, they were gatekeepers. Osiris judged your morality, Anubis guided your soul. Thoth tallied your record like a cosmic accountant. Hades locked the doors. Persephone decided the seasons of your return. Hermes escorted you down. You couldn't just die quietly. You had to negotiate a divine bureaucracy that made the DMV look merciful. The chilling part is how these beliefs bled back into daily life. Egyptians lived obsessed with preparation for death, saving for tombs, carving shabti, commissioning scribes to inscribe spells. Greeks agonized over burial rites, made offerings to the dead, and performed libations at tombs. Everyday religion wasn't just about pleasing gods while alive. It was about bribing, preparing, and begging for mercy after you were gone. The system ran so deep that death itself became another tax you never stopped paying. The irony, both cultures turned mortality into a tool of control. Pharaohs and priests promised paradise fields to the obedient, terror to the unruly. Greek cult leaders offered secret knowledge that could ease the darkness for a price. Death wasn't the end of divine authority. It was the final guarantee that no one ever escaped it. The gods had the last word, and it was carved into your coffin. If gods ruled on paper and in ritual, they ruled even louder in stone and spectacle. because nothing screams divine authority like a 50-ton block of limestone stacked on top of another 50-ton block, just to remind you that your ruler has both the gods and an endless supply of your labor on his side. Welcome to the architecture of divine power, ancient propaganda so big you couldn't ignore it even if you wanted to. Take the Egyptians first. The pyramids weren't just tombs, they were megaphones blaring across the desert. Look upon Pharaoh's eternal glory, you insignificant mortal. Imagine being a farmer, hauling stone under the burning sun, staring at a structure rising so high it practically touched Ra's sky barge. You weren't building a mausoleum, you were building proof that Pharaoh wasn't just a man. He was stitched into the cosmos itself. Every block laid was another brick in the divine illusion. And temples, forget cozy chapels. Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, these weren't places of quiet prayer. They were stone labyrinths designed to overwhelm. Columns soared like petrified forests, ceilings painted with stars, walls covered in hieroglyphs shouting eternal victories and divine decrees. When you walked in, you were supposed to feel small, swallowed up by eternity, with Pharaoh and the gods towering over you in stone. Architecture wasn't just structure, it was psychological warfare. The gods owned the skyline, and by extension, they owned you. But here's the genius. These projects doubled as public theater. Every festival, procession, and ritual spilled out into the courtyards and streets, turning the city into a stage. The Opet Festival, for example, paraded Amun's statue from Karnak to Luxor. Priests carried the god's gilded boat while crowds cheered, music blasted, and offerings poured in. It was divine Coachella, except you didn't get a choice about attending. Participation wasn't optional, it was cosmic affirmation. You clapped, you shouted, you watched Pharaoh bow before the god, and the message drilled into your skull was simple. Order exists, the gods are happy, Pharaoh is chosen, and you, dear commoner, are a cog in the machine. Now cross to Greece, where temples were smaller, but no less performative. The Parthenon wasn't just a temple to Athena. It was Athens flexing on the entire Greek world. Every column screamed, "We're rich, we're powerful, and our goddess has better taste than yours." Inside stood a colossal gold and ivory Athena, shining so bright she could blind you. Imagine being a visiting delegate, stepping into that glittering hall, and realizing your city's patron god was basically homeless in comparison. That's not just worship, it's intimidation wrapped in marble. And let's not forget the festivals. The Panathenaea, held every 4 years, was an all-out spectacle. A massive procession wound through Athens, bearing a new robe woven for Athena, ending at the Parthenon. There were contests, athletics, music, poetry, because nothing says piety like out-wrestling your neighbor in front of the goddess. Winners didn't just get glory, they got olive oil from Athena's sacred groves, which was worth a fortune. Religion, athletics, politics, all fused into one giant performance of civic pride under the goddess's watchful gaze. Then there were the Dionysian festivals, arguably the birthplace of Western theater. Imagine it, thousands packed into an open-air theater, watching tragedies and comedies that doubled as ritual offerings to Dionysus. Actors wore masks, choruses sang, and the city collectively processed themes of fate, justice, and divine wrath. It wasn't just entertainment, it was religion as mass therapy, binding the community through shared catharsis. And once again, the gods were center stage, demanding your emotional investment as much as your offerings. Architecture and spectacle worked hand in hand. Temples anchored cities physically and spiritually. Festivals brought them to life. Both were visual sermons in stone and sound, preaching messages of divine order, civic loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between gods and rulers. You couldn't walk through a temple courtyard without feeling dwarfed. You couldn't miss a festival without feeling excluded from the cosmic drama. Faith wasn't private, it was blasted into your senses, unavoidable, omnipresent. And the kicker, you paid for it all. Taxes funded temples. Labor built pyramids. Your grain supplied the feasts. When you cheered at a festival, you were celebrating the very system that drained your sweat. Yet it worked brilliantly, because whether you were dazzled by golden statues, awed by colossal columns, or carried away by music and theater, you believed, even for a moment, that the gods were there, smiling, nodding, approving. Divine authority wasn't just written in law or whispered in hymns. It was carved in stone, marched in processions, and staged in front of you until it became reality. You didn't just worship, you inhabited a world built to remind you at every turn who really held the power. And so, after walking through the kitchens of commoners, the battlefields of pharaohs, the festivals of gods, and even the bureaucratic waiting rooms of the afterlife, one truth keeps staring us down. Divine authority wasn't some abstract philosophy. It was daily life. It was the bread you ate, the taxes you paid, the prayers you mumbled, the stones you hauled, and the rules you followed long after death. It was all-encompassing, inescapable, and, let's be honest, brilliantly manipulative. The Egyptians perfected it with Ma'at, turning cosmic balance into a political tool. Obey Pharaoh, pay your dues, and maybe, just maybe, you'd party forever in the field of reeds. Defy him, and chaos swallowed you whole. The Greeks dressed it differently, giving their gods human tempers and petty jealousies, making divine authority feel like a reflection of the messy politics on Earth. But the pattern was the same. Whether it was Zeus hurling thunderbolts, or a moon receiving sacrifices, the gods didn't just govern the heavens, they governed you. What's stunning is how ordinary people lived within it. They weren't passive puppets. They negotiated, adapted, and even resisted in small ways. They carried charms into battle, cracked jokes during festivals, and whispered prayers that bent the rules in their favor. They built the pyramids, embroidered Athena's robe, lined up at the oracle, and, yes, sometimes they grumbled under their breath while doing it. Divine authority may have been colossal, but daily life was full of small acts of resilience. And it's that tension, the overwhelming weight of gods as rulers and the stubborn persistence of human survival that makes this world feel so vivid. Imagine living in a society where your boss is technically immortal, your taxes fund the gods' banquets, your city festival doubles as mandatory worship, and your eternity hinges on a cosmic weigh-in. Absurd, absolutely, but it worked. Entire civilizations thrived under that system. They built wonders that still tower over us, stories that still haunt us, and rituals whose echoes survive in traditions today. In the end, divine authority wasn't just about gods demanding loyalty. It was about humans needing meaning, order, and stability in a world that constantly threatened chaos. The gods filled that void, sometimes cruelly, sometimes generously, always with a heavy hand. And the people, whether hauling stone, weaving robes, or whispering hymns, carried on beneath it, leaving behind a legacy that still fascinates us. So, the next time you walk into a temple ruin or stare at a crumbling statue, remember, you're looking at more than stone. You're looking at propaganda, at a system designed to make people kneel, not just in fear, but in belief. You're looking at lives lived under the shadow of gods with very human demands. And maybe, just maybe, you're also looking at a mirror. Because while we no longer bow to Pharaoh or sacrifice goats to Zeus, the machinery of authority, grand, theatrical, and wrapped in spectacle, still hums all around us. Different costumes, different names, same play. Thanks for walking this long road back through history with me. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the divine drama of daily life, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. And as always, dim the lights, keep your imagination switched on, and remember, history isn't dead. It's still whispering, carved in stone, waiting for us to listen.